So how do you pick the colour? In the previous video, we've alluded to the kind of the colour palette and the idea that you're really only constrained to about 3 to 5 colours. What about the choice of colours? Now, there are a series of videos to go through, very short videos on this, because there are a number of things to think about. One is colour, what we call colour sensitivity. But colour choice is really important. And you may argue, well, I'm not sure how relevant this is to me as a scientist, but actually fundamentally it's linked to that whole debate that this assessment, and really in many ways this module, is about, which is trying to communicate effectively. So the colour choice is really important in being able to achieve that. And so the first thing to recognise is legibility of colours really does matter. Because if you pick poor colours, then you make your infographic ineligible. People can't read it. People can't interpret what it is you're trying to convey. So I would say to you really straight away, pay as much attention as possible to the colour that's under the text as to the text itself. I think quite often we focus on the text colour. But actually, if you notice the colours that are being used here, we're using a particular way of doing this. You've got to avoid colour contrasts. You've got to get that contrast right. So a classic colour contrast that doesn't work is red text on a black background. Blue on green, for example, don't work. And that's really due to the idea of our ability to perceive information. The key to this is understanding a little bit about the way the visual cortex works and the way in which the eye can distinguish information in relation to the colours that they're used. We know quite a bit, I suspect, about the way we perceive shapes and patterns and so on. But clearly you've got this notion as well that, you know, there's a lot of people that can't distinguish particular shades or even particular colours. Now, don't confuse that with colour blindness. That's a completely different thing. But a large proportion of the population will have some issue, which is kind of a colour vision deficiency. And so they just can't distinguish, particularly when we get to kind of fine shades, variations on the same colour thing, people can't distinguish them. And so if you're using those colours to kind of separate out components in your infographic, it makes it much, much harder for people to distinguish and therefore interpret what you're putting to them. And, you know, in terms of the kind of the why, well, first thing is to think about, aging. You may well be getting, older people who may be reading your infographic, but the amount of light that reaches the back of the eye reduces with age. So it's also affected by things like screen size, resolution, contrast. So all of these make it much harder because the contrast is then lower. So you have to think very carefully. You notice, for example, the colour choice that's used here. Notice how the dark background, which isn't black, because black actually would produce, particularly with the orange yellow, doesn't work particularly well in terms of the contrast, but the blue enables the yellow and the white to pop. They're readable, but they're not creating a contrast that is distracting. And that's really what we've got to get to with our infographics. It's about using colours that enable us to project our images and project our thoughts. So let's have a quick look at some good examples of this in infographics. Okay, so here's an okay example. All right, it's not perfect, but it's okay. They've used this cyany blue green, and they've tried to use some variations, but they've tried to make sure that the colours do stand out. So there are not any kind of glaring contrasts here. So in other words, where they've used variations of the same colour, notice that they are not small graduations, they're quite large. You've gone from a very dark blue-green into a much lighter blue-green. It's not kind of just variations on the same shade, and that's really what we need to think about. And notice also that the one part that is perhaps the hardest to read, which is perhaps the bit of the infographic that doesn't work quite so well, is the bit at the bottom, where men are more likely than women to average 6 or more hours of total sedentary sitting. Can you notice that because it's a slightly lighter font on a white background, it doesn't work quite as well? Whereas although it is larger as well, I'd agree, but it stands out better, which is the 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men in England, is a much clearer font on that colour of background. So you need to think about the colour contrasts when you're putting your infographics together. This works beautifully. Okay, so very, very clear in terms of the colour backgrounds. So we've got no glaring contrasts because of the colour choices that have been used, and the fonts stand out against those colours. So fundamentally, that's what you've got to think about. You do not want to be picking colour palettes that drown out your information. So that's really important, and you need to spend time thinking about that. It's not a case of just throwing colours on the infographic and thinking that they're going to look great. It is much, much more complicated, and it's the art of what's called colour science. So please pay attention to that when you're putting your infographics together.